Okay, so today we're going to be talking about how we teach ourselves by knowing ourselves first. And, I think a lot of us, when we start off with life, we lack this true autonomy, right? Especially when we're younger, right? And autonomy means basically the agency or the freedom to think and to do for ourselves. And a lot of people don't grasp that until much later in life. They don't have this true concept of the identity of who they are. And you hear me talk a lot about this agency as people and being able to make our own choices and act on our own free will. We have this concept, I think, of the known safe place in our world, right? Where we're comfortable. But then we very seldom, once we reach that place, do we want to reach out of that place, right? Because it's comfortable. It's satisfying. There's no fear there. There's no concern there, right? We can just kind of live in this comfortable place that that allows us to just be who we are, right? And we don't ever have to push the envelope of that, right? And I guess my question is if all we ever do is identify as only who we are, the same thing every single day, what do we ever truly become? How do we ever truly know who we really are, and how do we evolve? Not just how we evolve as individuals, is you know, professionals or as students or as academics or whatever the case may be, but how do you really evolve as a society, as a species of humans, if we never really constantly reinvent this idea of who we are, and if we never step into unsafe places or unsafe ideas or unsafe arenas? And I think that as we go through this discussion today, I want you to think about education is the place that's unsafe. Now, I think we all want to know who we are before we become something else, right? Okay. So a lot of people they say, well, I want to be this, that, or the other. I want to identify as this. Let me tell you something. There's a big difference between want and actually being, right? I can say that I want to be a millionaire, right? And then I can go around telling people that, well, I'm a millionaire. Doesn't mean that I am. I mean that's the reality of this, the cold hard truth of this. You can walk around and you can say that you want to be cat. You're not necessarily going to be a cat because that's just how you think you want to be. Deep down you're still a human being. You're still a person. You still have an anatomy of a human being. You have the mind of a human being. You have the behaviors of a human being. And no matter how much you try to be something you're not, you're still going, certain limitations are going to limit you to being what you really are. You have to discover that for yourself. In this context, we're talking about the learning journey. So don't take this out of context. I'm not turning this into a deep lecture about identity politics, although I know some of you will try. What I'm really getting at here is learning who we are in order to educate ourselves beyond our current state, our current level of being. So we have to have this idea of conscience, self-awareness. We have to have this idea that we have this perfect voice inside us that's imperfect. And we have to accept those imperfections. And that imperfection means that we're still learning. We're still representing moral awareness. We have that inner voice that we can rely on that guides us, but it doesn't guarantee the most perfect results or the most ideal outcome in a situation, right? I can remember that there were times in my life as I look back on this where all I had to rely on was that still small voice on the inside of me. And some people will say that that's a spiritual thing, and some people will say it's conscience, and they'll say it's all sorts of things. But I think it's just that voice of truth, that voice of reason inside of you, that's pushing you on towards something that's more important than just what you want to be, and if it's a rocket scientist or a psychologist or whatever it is, don't beat yourself up over this if that still small voice leads you into a hole that ends up with a bad grade or a bad result or a bad paper or whatever. Just get over it. Move on. It's okay. It's not going to define your whole life. And you have to accept there's going to be failures and imperfections along the way. So so I think that what we need to do is begin looking at something bigger, something more impossible, something more challenging, something that really motivates us to being more than what we are. And Jung talks about this a lot. I've studied Jung a lot over my career. And if we look at this, you'll see how this Jungarian philosophy plays in deeper into this lecture and into this thought process as we go along, and you'll be able to identify some of that here. So going back to this, I think you have to realize that you're going to have to leave the comforts of home. You're going to have to leave the comforts of the things that make you comfortable. You're going to have to go and find a new job, find some new territory to map, find a new culture, find a new safety net. Recognize these things within yourself and be willing to learn and be able to accept the things that you can do and the things that you can't do. Learn a moral awareness from every situation. This is perhaps one of the most important things you can do. I've often used this quote that was told to me one time. uh, One man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. That's a moral awareness. And then within that moral awareness, you see these imperfect results. You see these imperfect outcomes. You see these imperfect tragedies that really affect people's lives on a deep basis. So you have to recognize these things all within yourself. And you have to say, you know what, look, it's kind of like the Alcoholics Anonymous, right? Lord, give me the strength to change the things that I can change, and, to hell with the rest of it, or something like that. I've never been to AA, but this is, I know that much. Give me the strength to change the things that I can change, and find it within yourself to change those things, and to hell with everything else. There's comfort and safety, right? But and it goes back to this whole idea that if you never leave mom and daddy, if you never leave the box, if you never leave the nest, the bird doesn't fly. You don't get mature. This whole idea of coddling children until they're 30 years old or whatever. I don't subscribe to it. I don't believe in it. I think that what we need to do is we need to examine within ourselves what we're doing. There's a temptation of life there, that you want to keep them protected and keep them safe. Let the kids go and make a big mistake, you know? Let them ruin their own life for a little bit. Be the safety net to catch them. My father did that to me a lot. He encouraged me a lot to go and read widely and think differently and see beyond just the safety net. So that way, when he eventually died, when I was pretty young, my father died when I was 30. In my, yeah, about 30, I guess, 28, something like this. Don't remember exactly how old I was, but he prepared me for this day without it. Because one day he knew that he was not going to be there. And so all of my life it was forcing me out the nest almost. It was preparing me for the journey and the temptations of life that were always going to be there. And sometimes life is a very chaotic place. Sometimes life is a very difficult place to deal with. We have to accept that chaos. We have to accept that it's not always going to be easy. And one thing that I've kind of learned about myself is that, and perhaps all of us to some extent, is that we have to tell the truth about it. We can't sit there and just, for God's sake, believe this idea that I want to be something my whole life. I never wanted to be a poor kid, from the rural South, a farm boy from the rural South. I never wanted to be this guy, but the truth was, I was just a regular kid from the rural South. And then I had to take responsibility for that and take ownership for that. And as I did, I began to transform that into this character that I am today. And it took 40 something years to get here. And it wasn't always the easiest journey, but it was a real journey. And it helped me not just transform myself, but transform other people along the way. And perhaps maybe in some ways transform society. One thing I've learned from people over the years is that they're often afraid to venture into chaos. They don't want to venture into anything that's going to cause them distress or emotional harm or anything like that. Sometimes you have to. You just have to, you know, because this is where you grow. This is where you expand. This is where you dig deeper into life, right? And without this chaos, you can't grow. Without this chaos, you can't be who it is that you really needed to become in the first place. You can't just ignore all of these realities, You have to accept some of this and accept the risk of buying into chaos. I remember I was talking one time to an early Apollo astronaut, and I had a really interesting opportunity to be able to sit and talk with him for several hours. His name was John Young. Coincidentally, he walked on the moon, and he was also the commander of the very first space shuttle that went into space. And I asked him, I said, well, John, how did you react, sitting on top of this rocket that had never really been tested before? Talking about the space shuttle. And he just looked at me and he's this way that only John Young could. You have to buy into risk. I mean, you have to accept it. One or two things is going to happen. It's going to work out all right, or it's not. And that stuck with me so much when John Young said that, because they were traveling into space on this massive rocket that had been built. They didn't know how this thing was going to react. They didn't know if it was even going to work. I mean, 10 million moving parts or something like this, and it was just this incredible thing. And you didn't know it was going to work, but he knew that one of two things was going to happen. It was going to work out all right, or it wasn't. There's no in between. Because they were willing to take that risk and venture into that chaos and the unknown, they were willing to learn things about this thing. Now, sure, in the space shuttle program, there were accidents, there were near misses, there were big problems. But you have to be able to learn from that chaos. You have to be able to learn from that fear. Because when you venture into that chaos of the unknown, that's really where you grow. So, what is the role of self truth in all of this? Well, I think, you hear this thing, that's real. You hear that saying a lot, that's real. This is real. You're a real guy, whatever. What does that really mean? What does that really mean? I think that it means to align yourself with the truths of who and what you are and to integrate that truth into yourself without being controlled by external forces, right? Without, you know, being controlled by impulses and rule sets that come from the outsider. even our own ignorance, right? You can't just live your life playing ignorant the whole time, and you can't just wander through society repeating things that you've already heard. You have to self explore. You have to go out and find new meaning, and you have to go out and find a new reason to be there. You have to be motivated. I deal a lot with people from across the country and or across the world, and a lot of these students want to come to the very best universities in America, but then they seem that it's difficult to get in there. They lose motivation, they lose interest, they lose everything that is about them. And when you lose this interest, it's because they've lost the truth within themselves. They've lost the ability to think for themselves. They've lost the idea to explore and to push themselves to the boundaries. They allow themselves to be conformed to an image or an idea that they think exists. And then when it seems like that is just too damn hard to get, they begin to give up. They begin to lose it. They begin to say, you know what, this is just too hard. I can't do it. And then they start playing ignorant. Well, I'm sorry, I couldn't get my work turned in today. I didn't know this question. I didn't know how to do this. Well, did you think to freaking ask? Maybe somebody could have helped you. Oh, I didn't know. I hate that response. I didn't know. I didn't know. You didn't know because you didn't ask. You can't play ignorant to everything in your life. So here's what I think. And this is what I think Jung and Piaget, to some extent, teaches us. Dostoevsky. If you read some of this literature, you read that there's suffering, there's risk, there's the unknown, and then there's the voluntary acceptance of responsibility within all of this. And I think to become a real person, a real learner, a real thinker, you have to find it within yourselves to automatically respect or accept the responsibility for your own education. The sooner you do that, the better you become. I think Piaget taught us this, the Jean Piaget, with children specifically. He's considered the father of behavioral and developmental psychology. Piaget teaches, and in one of my other lectures, I'm talking about this English Romanian adoptee scheme that happened back in the 80s. A horrible situation. Could have been a lot worse, but thank God it wasn't. But it was terrible the way it was. But we learned a lot about this, about how when kids get this nurturing earlier in life, right, and that becomes the real focus of the parents or the parental figure. The culture figure, the father figure, if you will, or the nature figure, and the mother, whatever it is. Pinocchio, I think it was the blue fairy in Geppetto, right? If you look at this, right, and you look at all this, these archetypal figures, they frame how culture and nature shape who we are in a transformative way. So we have to be willing to accept all of this. We have to be willing to buy into all of this. And if you don't, I really don't know what to tell you. I really just don't know what to tell you, because if we look at the research that just and the data, it tells us that the people who never accept this sooner rather than later, it's very hard for them to overcome this and adapt this later on in life. And I think as people reach the middle age of life, to be middle-aged adult, they find it even harder to accept this. Look, we all love a good story. We do, and especially even as we're children, we all love a good story, whether it's the story of Pinocchio or the story of Cinderella or whatever it is you like to read, right? We all love a good story, and we have to understand these stories are not just for our own amusement. What they're actually doing is they're encoding deep psychological theory and human psychology and meaning and purpose and moral development into ourselves, and it's helping us orient ourselves to the world, and helping us orient the world to who we are, because we can create figures of ourselves, and we can create people, and we can create holistic approaches. And as we become more and more into the artificial age, this artificial intelligence and stuff like this, your genuine ability to learn and genuine ability to connect yourself to the world is going to be what's the most important thing. It's going to be what drives you. It's going to be what teaches you new things. It's going to be what carries you forward into the world. And that's a real beautiful thing. So I want you to remember that as we read these, we all like to read these stories that are on the New York Times bestsellers list and all this stuff, but maybe we need to go back and read some childhood books to really understand who it is we are and what we are. Because we need to understand the human psychology and the moral truth at the most simplified level in order to really apply it to our lives, because we all really truly think like children. Okay, so I want to thank you for joining me here in this discussion today about learning to learn and learning to learn who we are so we can learn even better. I think this is a real important discussion to have. And as we continue this research and continue this journey and continue this thought process, maybe we should put away all of the self-help books and go back to some children's books. Go back and read Pinocchio, go back and read The Wizard of Oz, go back and read, some, maybe some Moby Dick, something like that, the Swiss Family Robinson. Read some of these books, these young readers, before you go and pick up a Dr. Phil or an Oprah book, or a Joel Osteen book or something like that. Maybe you should go back and read the very basic stories of childhood existence. If you do, learn how to apply them. That's what I did. Thank you very much.